Oh, there we go.
I remember when Matt used to have a goatee, and you know,
Yeah, I'm an old wizened man.
man, and you used to have even your bag, if you're racing across the conference floor, you would wear it like a bandolier, you know, stuffed with bullets, Marxist bullets.
Yeah, there we go. I was trying to remember. I'm sorry that we're totally ignoring our moderator, but I was trying to think about. I believe, you can correct me, Amitabha, that we were introduced about 20 years ago by, I want to say it was Jack Halberstam. Is that possible?
Could be, of course. Good friend, old friend. But I also think Nikhil Pal Singh and we had that other person in common.
Could have been.
And his girlfriend, whom Gayatri Spivak once asked me if I was going to steal her from him. And I was like, what? Whatever, man.
Yes, hi Leah. Sorry. We're out of hand. We're out of control.
I know. I like that you guys are trying to figure out the genealogy. When was the last time you two saw each other in person?
20 years.
20 years ago?
I think so. 15, 20.
No.
I think about that. I think it was at the ASA, like in some unknown city, around 2000 or thereabouts. It wasn't long after passport photos came out.
That's right.
Which, by the way, I should just say off the top, that was a really important book to me.
Man, I owe you a lot. You have no idea. I'm telling Leah that, you know, people have often mentioned this, so I'll acknowledge that publicly also. But listen. By which I mean, people have often mentioned that they have studied it in your class, and then I encounter them in other places, you know? So it's amazing. Tell me another thing.
That book was life-changing for me too in graduate school.
No, man. But Leah, how come you're so much better lit than sorry people like me, man?
Well, I'm sitting above light. There's lighting right above me. That's why.
Damn. Very good. Very good. Matt, of course, looks like, you know, a wizard from Harry Potter.
I have to say, Leah, I don't know if you're seeing this, but I'm watching an incredible storm beginning to brew right outside my window.
Yes. We already had it here. Wind blowing through it, you know.
Yeah. So let's see, maybe we can, I think there's still people streaming in, so I'll give everybody a couple more minutes to stream in and we can get started. I assume that a lot of people
sure.
are gonna need some time to decompress before the
Kamala Harris.
The debate tonight. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to watch it, man. Yeah. Listen.
Matt, will you watch it?
Matt, did you hear Leah's question?
I know things are breaking up quite a bit. I don't know if it's the weather or what, but that was coming in and out. I'm really sorry.
No, it's okay. Well, we'll keep our eye and ear to that. My question was, are you going to watch the debate tonight?
I am afraid I will be doing that. Yes.
Yeah.
I won't say I'm looking forward to it, but it feels like a very important thing to keep our eye on.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe if it's okay with both you guys, I'll get started. And Matt, you're right. There's a lot of lightning and wind outside, so we might get disturbed a little bit. The Wi-Fi might get disturbed. So, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Leah Mirkor, lecturer in ethnicity, race, and migration. And I just want to begin by thanking Matt Jacobson and Karen Rothman, especially directors in the Public Humanities program, and Alicia Camacho and Zarina Gurwal and ERNM for supporting this event and making it possible. It's a real pleasure to welcome you and join Matt Jacobson and Amitabha Kumar in a conversation about scholars and their publics. I'd like to begin with brief introductions of our writers, followed by a conversation between us for about 30 to 45 minutes. And then we'll take some questions from the audience, some of which undergraduates and graduate students in my public writing class and colloquium have prepared in advance. Matthew Jacobson is William Robertson Co-Professor of American Studies and History and Co-Director of the Public Humanities Program at Yale. He's the author of 7 books on race, politics, and culture in the US, among them Odeda's One Grain of Sand, as well as Barbarian Virtues, the United States Encounters Foreign Peoples at Home and Abroad, and Whiteness of a Different Color, European Immigrants and the Alchemy of Race. Tonight we'll be discussing The Historian's Eye, Photography, History, and the American Present, published by UNC Press. Amitava Kumar is Professor of English on the Helen D. Lockwood Chair at Vassar College. He's the author of several works of nonfiction and 3 novels. His 2018 book, Immigrant Montana, was on the list of most notable books of the year, the New York Times and the New Yorker. And some of his other books include Lunch with a Bigot, Passport Photos, and Bombay, London, New York. His latest book, A Time Outside This Time, a novel, will be published by Knopf in 2021. And tonight we'll be discussing his 2019 work, Every Day I Write the Book. Matt and Amitava are both writers whose work on the page and in the world I greatly admire and learn from all the time, and I'm delighted to be in conversation with both of them. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Leah.
So if I could, I want to begin with this question about writing about the present. Matt, in The Historian's Eye, you reflect on your own photographs taken between 2009 and 13 and the historical significance of the Obama presidency. You write, quote, "The historicization of the present and very recent past, at once conceptual and visual, is at the heart of the project." And you explain that in a culture with a short memory and a public discourse that is, quote, contracted, the sound bites and Twitter characters need to cultivate and emphasize historical reflection. Amitava, in Every Day I Write the Book, which has been called a book for academic writers, the way Dillard's Writing Life or King's On Writing was for creative writers, you emphasize how the book is a book of practical advice for writing. And you've been drawn to text that blurred the academic and the creative, and to writing that hasn't been produced to, quote, please a committee, but instead met the urgency of experience. In both books, you address the cultural, political, and academic silences and gaps you've encountered by creating your own manifestos on how to read, write, and see, a way for you to build a language and medium to distill the urgency of and for the present. So I'm wondering if you can talk about what writing about the present entails and why that's important to you, maybe perhaps, especially now.
Matt, you go first.
Okay, I will do that. Well, let me just say that the Historian's Eye project started out of the poignance of that moment right after the Obama election and in between the Obama election and the first Obama inauguration, when, in quotes here, this historical moment was just on everybody's lips. Everyone was talking about this historical moment and obsessing on it and reflecting on it in a way that was quite unusual for a culture that really is pretty ahistorical and amnesiac. So I was interested in that. And I was interested in the question of whether the camera can be a historian's instrument. Can you go out in the world with a camera and do historical work with it? Where I ended up, and the answer to that question, I mean, I could probably argue it either way, and we can talk about that. But the more important thing that came out of that for me was that the camera taught me to think about the present in a different way in relationship to history. So for me, working in the present, since I'm a historian, writing about the present is always about finding new ways to write historically. And what changed me about the project with camera in hand was that we tend to think, and I think we're taught to think, that history is linear for one thing, and it's behind us. It's either we've left it behind and it's distant. And what the camera was teaching me was that that is not the case at all, that history is actually, it's more like the geological formation that we're standing on, and that it surrounds us, and that history is what the present is made of. So the trick for me was to think historically about the present, and that is just a very different exercise than knowing history. Knowing history is still necessary, that's kind of the part A. But the part B of thinking historically about the present is kind of jarring loose the idea that the point is to kind of narrate our way through the 20th century, and rather it's to see those historical traces everywhere we look, and to figure out how to interpret them and how to understand them and how to see them and how to see how they're shaping our present, to see how the history is delivering us to the moment that we're in. And I think, you know, for the specifics of the Obama moment, I mean, one of the things that I learned over the course of that project, and I think it's clear as day in the book, even though every word of that book except the afterword was written before the 2016 election, I think that that's a study in the rise of Trumpism. I mean, even before Trump came down the escalator, and you could just see it. And I think that, to me, that was kind of the significance of that project, was understanding how to read the present and how to think historically about it. And that's totally left a mark on my teaching. I'll never teach history the same way again. I think I'll always stay with that idea that our students don't need to narrate the 1920s, but they do need to understand the traces that the 1920s have left with us and are still shaping, you know, a city like New Haven, right? Let's talk about the Great Migration and how important that is. So it's thinking historically, but it's just in a different register than I had done for the first 20 years of my career.
And the camera was instrumental to that.
I think you'll have to repeat the question, Leah.
I was just reiterating that the camera was instrumental to that, it sounds like.
I think Matt is having some trouble
on the Zoom. But Ami, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Well, first of all, Leah, thank you so much for your labor in the literary commons, as it were.
Yeah.
Okay. I think Matt is saying something. Yeah.
I don't know if you guys can hear me. Everyone is frozen and I'm not hearing anything.
Okay.
But you should go ahead.
Okay.
And I'll try to get you back on my phone.
Okay. So even though Matt can't hear me, I have to say thank you, Matt, for teaching passport photos. And the great Lisa Lowe, I think, is right now in the audience listening to us too. So on the West Coast, Lisa Lowe, and on the East Coast, Matt Jacobson. Now she's at Yale, I know, but because of their teaching passport photos, I think I'll be able to send my children to college. So thank you for that. It's very good. Now about the present, you know, can I, because we are also discussing the academy, one thing I want to just sort of mention from this book that you were kind enough to mention, Leah, Every Day I Write the Book. There's a 2 to 3 page thing on journals, you know, and it starts with some journal saying to a contributor, sending a letter to the contributor, and it says, in an effort to speed up publication, dear blah blah blah, in an effort to speed up the publication schedule and work through a backlog, we are attempting to collect any remaining permissions from authors, and it goes on in that way, and it then says to this writer, please return these permissions. Cool. And then I cite the contributor's letter to the journal. It says, dear journal of blah, blah. Thank you so much for your note. I was very grateful when you accepted my article for publication in your journal 7 years ago. Since that time, approximately 5 years ago, you forgot that you have accepted the article and resent it through your review process, after which you sent me a rejection letter based on the insane rants of an inflamed tea partier, anachronistic, I know, and it goes on. A year later, you sent me a letter similar to the one above. I'm reading this out in order to say to you, because you asked us about the present, and I understand the context in which you're asking, but I just want to say, we sometimes live in a hellish eternal present of the academy. Time doesn't weigh on us in the same way. We might in cocktail conversations or in corridors talk about it, and maybe it happens in history departments, but the pressure of the present in our practices, in the way we conduct business in our departments, the way people will talk, at least at my institution, about who we should hire or what, is never, for me, ever in the living moment of the present. It is often refers back to 20 years before, 10 years before. And this exchange between a contributor and the journal is a particularly egregious example for me of how the academy conducts its business. Does that make sense to you? Kind of, Leah? But let me address the question that you might have had in mind when you said writing about the present. You know, in this book, one of the examples or models I hold up is Claudia Rankine, Citizen, okay? Because you asked the question about the cross genre, I'm very much struck by the fact that Rankine's book was nominated for an award at I think it was the National Book Critics Circle, both in the poetry section and in the criticism section. I mean, that's hashtag goals. You know what I'm saying? I mean, to have it, these two different categories, that's what we should be going for. And the reason why I'm choosing her to talk about the present is because if you open her book and read, for example, that lovely, lovely and tragic line, because white men can't police their imagination, black men are dying, you find near it that the book will say in memory of, and it lists names that have now become a part of the American mainstream. Eric Garner, for example, Michael Brown. And on my edition, it has 4 names or 5 names. On my students' editions, tragically again, it has 8 names. I want to applaud the fact that Claudia Rankine has written a book that offers testimony in its different editions to the changing present, the more and more horrible realities. So I am applauding both the idea of how it is a cross-genre book, but also how it is situated in the present or answers a need of the present in a way that addresses, testifies to how things change and how even the list of the people killed has been, you know, alas, increasing every day.
Thanks so much for both of those comments. I think relatedly, I want to ask both of you how you envision and write to the publics and what style and aesthetics have to do with this. Matt, I'm wondering how this might relate to the way you discuss the role of documentary photography and the role of being a witness to history in your book. And Amitabh, I'm thinking about this question in the way you emphasize how much style and form matter in everyday, and how you encourage your fellow writers to develop, like Susan Sontag, a sense of aesthetics that matches the about politics. So Matt, I don't know if maybe you want to go first again?
Sure, yes. You know, the aesthetic question is a really interesting one to me because I think that pursuit of mine is probably more pronounced in my later work than in my earlier work. It's always been a concern of mine. And in fact, the turning point, or the kind of the point of viability for me in any project that I've worked on, and this goes for every project I've worked on, is that moment when I can imagine the project as a thing of beauty. And you know, I don't claim success in any case, but that's been an important marker for me in how I understand my relationship to the work. Is if I can understand, I mean, because as you know, I mean, a lot of my work is pretty dark. I mean, I've been wading around in the cesspool of racism and really toxic power relations for my entire career. But being able to render that in a way that is not to aestheticize terror, but to write in a register that is arresting. The way a photograph can be arresting, that's always been part of the project for me. This added layer for me of going out into the world with a camera and doing kind of documentary work / history of the present. One of the things I learned so much from just the experience. Part of it, I think of it almost as affect theory, but in practice. That, you know, and you directed me to that one photograph that I took at the, it was one of the healthcare rallies in 2009, which is just I mean, it's a very complicated photograph that we can talk about, but the affective register of it is really powerful. And it's one of the things that I think gets lost, or got lost anyway, for the generation of historians who trained me. We were not trained to think about affect. We were not trained to think about feeling. We were trained really carefully in kind of the archival work and argumentation and all of these things, evidentiary base and all of that. But we weren't really trained to think about human feeling. And I think that one of the things that I learned out in the field was how important affect is in history. And I think now, what we're living through now, I mean, I just can't help but think about, like 1930s Germany or the early Stalinist era in the USSR. And I feel now it's like, oh, they must have been really furious and depressed. And that's like a really important part of the history that gets lost to the record. So I feel like, that experience of being out in the street with people in 2009, 2010 helped me as a historian to kind of understand some of the dimensions of history itself that I'd never been really trained to look for. And now I see it more, I mean, not just in affect theory, but you think about someone like Saidiya Hartman, who in her more speculative and cutting edge work in her most recent book is really just making the radical proposition that as scholars, our own humanity is a resource and we ought to draw upon it. And I think that just got trained right out of me when I was in grad school, and it's taken, a pretty long career to find my way back to it. But I think that's a really, really important lesson in thinking about our publics and thinking about who that might be and how we might best reach them.
Mm.
So I'm thinking of that question in my context. Many years ago, well, when I was a grad student, I would take pictures, for example, of protest, but also other things. And I would write little essays that I thought were, little polished gems of elegant theorizing. And I would send it quickly to some place like Social Text. It would reject me. They would reject me right away and send it back. And then I would send it to Public Culture and they would reject it and send it back. And I remember in one of those pieces writing something like, which I have then smuggled into a piece in this book. It goes something like, but I didn't share the belief seemingly dear to the editors of special issues devoted to post-colonial theory that the 3.2 million poor in Chiapas or the 500,000 beggars in Calcutta hungered to read debates between the elite of New York and New Delhi in the pages of scholarly journals. What I'm trying to say there is that I sensed from the inception of my career here in this country that there was a great divide between what was said about people and where the people actually lived or what they did. So for me, the idea of the public has been very important because I've always thought, especially when I think about post-colonial theory, but it never tried to address an audience that was different from that of the theorists themselves. And I thought that bound them in a certain kind of defensive postures, which was debilitating. So for me, the attempt has always been, not always successfully, just like Matt was being humble and saying his photographs, I was like, I'm not claiming anything other than a great tenacity in attempting to reach a wider audience than the folks one would hear at the MLA when one was young and able to go to conferences and tolerate the sort of verbiage that was pouring forth from both the podium and from the fawning audience. So for me, the search for audience has meant sometimes, Matt was speaking about affective. By the way, I've always not really liked the term affect theory. You guys might have a different fondness for it. I have not, because the moment one thinks of affect theory, one is already retreating from real affect, from blood, from tears, from feeling. That's what I feel. Anyway, one of the examples I cite in this book is of this book called Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. The narrator is a scholar, literary scholar, working on Ted Hughes. His wife dies. He has 2 children. And so when we read his content, Chapter 1, magical dangers, but it is under erasure, and it says, I miss my wife. Chapter 2, reign of silence. It's also under erasure. I miss my wife. Chapter 3, unkillable trickster. That's also under erasure. I miss my wife. You get the picture. I would love it if more and more academic writing, with its stated purpose, allowed for spaces where it gets overwhelmed by something else, where you are able to state, I miss my wife, or my child has died, or my husband has left me, or it is really fucking difficult to do the work when I'm paid so little and I'm an adjunct working in 5 different places, etc., etc. You get my picture. So that's where I think of both the idea of a public, how to engage a public. I mean, I think it's very, very important. And that's why I responded. Apart from my debt to people like Matt who teach, I said yes immediately to invitation because I thought, public humanities, what a lovely idea. You know, again, because we might have graduate students listening here, I want to tell you, 20 years ago, it was very different. When I was entering this profession, I would see any public, the word public even, you know, Duke had a series called Public Planet. I would send my proposal there. I got rejected. You know, passport photos wasn't published by them, but I would send it to the public with that idea that, man, all I want to do is engage a wider public than a committee of 4, you know? And thank you to all the people who help you in that. I think the picture has changed, you know? And I think, let's say Matt's, for example, producing a book which has pictures and critical commentary, just opens up more and more space, you know, for younger people to do that sort of thing. So I'm sorry that my responses are also coming across as rants, but I love you all. You know what I'm saying?
Well, I'm wondering if we can transition to the way both of you approach and deal with fake news.
Oh man, no. Let me interrupt you. Fake news? I'm drinking my wonderful green tea from a mug that has this lovely quote by Hannah Arendt. So I must interrupt you to read this. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, that is, the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, that is, the standards of thought, no longer exist. So that's the kind of a response. But Matt, answer the question, buddy.
Well, here.
Oh, no, I have to, can I just add a rejoinder to that? Because I think in the context of what's happening in the White House right now, there's this Hannah Arendt quote that I think is really important. She said, the totalitarian government does not just lie and say that there's no such thing as unemployment. The totalitarian government abolishes unemployment benefits. And I think, you know, that's kind of where we are right now. So if we're going to talk about Hannah Arendt, just thought I'd throw that out there.
Beautiful. I didn't allow you to even finish your question, Leah. Sorry, don't throw me out of the panel.
I won't. I want to connect the writers, your sense of the writer's responsibility to truth, to the editing process. That's one connection I saw in both your works. Matt, you say that photographs always lie even as they tell the truth. And here I'm wondering if we can pull up the image that you referred to earlier. We have it on PowerPoint. And Amitabha, you say that our responsibility as writers is only to be honest, even if it means being base or wrong. And I'm wondering if you both can elaborate on this, not just on what it means to, what the responsibility to truth is, but again, what editing has to do with this.
Sure. Well, so one of the things that I mean by that in reference to photography is that the ideological power of photography as a form is that it's so disarming because it does present itself as truth, no matter what. A photograph, it just looks like it's a little slice of reality right there, kind of unproblematically so. It's always edited, even if it's not heavily edited. There are things that are in the frame and things that are outside the frame, usually quite intentionally so. The difference between a wide shot and a narrow shot might change the meaning entirely. This is digital photography, but even in analog photography, the choices that are made about how to make certain shades or colors pop and others recede. Meaning is managed. Meaning is always managed between the photographer and the image, and also is received in a way that the meaning changes yet again between the image and the viewer. And all of this has to do with context and historical moment and everything else. So that's what I mean when I say the photograph is always lying. It's never telling you a plain truth. On the other hand, you know, like a novel or like a poem or like a well-executed work of art, it can embody a truth that might not be so accessible otherwise. So in the book, I talk about this particular image as a very selective kind of moment on my part. I found the most photogenic person in the crowd. And as I raised my camera, he made himself more photogenic still. And it just made it, so there's a lot of performativity to this, to this photograph, but I think it captures something about that moment in the healthcare debate that was totally lost in the political discourse and will probably be lost to history in general. But there was a lot of suffering out in the streets when people were fighting for Obamacare. And that's one of the things, that's the truth, I think, that this heavily redacted, heavily performative photograph captures.
Matt, if I can also just ask you to add, how did you, before you started the book and then as you were working on the book, how did you envision the relationship between the text and the photographs? I imagine that, you know, I mean, you took countless photographs over a pretty long period of time. So how did you imagine the relationship?
Well, this is really important because this was a product of a 10-year evolution, or almost 10-year, 8 years, let's say. So it started really just with a photographic archive that I was building and collecting, and that was done in conjunction with oral histories that I was conducting. And so the first station stop was a website, and the second station stop was a gallery installation that was kind of like a first draft of the book, although not nearly as text heavy. The idea of pairing the photographs with writings really came out of, I guess, two commitments. One was to not let the photographs stand for themselves because they do lie, but also to take each one as an occasion to reflect historically and to try to kind of bring an extra layer or two of meaning out of what ended up in the frame of the shot. And so that's where what I end up with, and I learned so much from this process, and I think it probably will affect the way I work forever. But I really did come up with this way of thinking about the hunch and the treatise. And the hunch is the kind of historian's sense in the moment that there's something in the frame that is meaningful beyond the moment, or that is capturing something that's deep. And then the treatise is, you know, upon reflection and upon interpretation and upon in meditation. I use that word quite literally, you know, meditating and really thinking about an image and what is there. And as I said in the book, I mean, there are aspects of the hunch that the treatise can't improve upon, but the other thing is also true. And I always wanted them, from the moment I had the idea of turning this material into a book, that's how I wanted it to work.
Great, thank you. Amitabha?
You know, Matt, I liked in the prose, I liked the riffs on photography itself the most. Yeah. Well, not the most, but you know, I appreciated that. I mean, starting with when you explain why you have black and white instead of color, down to where you say the camera loves a good juxtaposition. And when you talk about the camera mentors you in a kind of noticing that is crucial for a culture like ours. A culture whose claims are loud, whose pace is fast, and whose momentum continually jostles and buffets us away from quieter contemplations. I mean, you're teaching us how to see and how to look at your own images. And that's and it has such a reflective tone to it that it's great. It works great. Now,
thank you for saying that.
Your question, what I went looking for when you talked about fake news, my novel that's coming out is actually about fake news, but I want to attempt to say something first about academia in order to come. I mean, when you're confronted by fake news, you want to say, that's fake. This is the truth. Cool? Okay. So you have to occupy the position of being in the know.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it was difficult in the novel, but even before, because for a while I had been practicing a stance, which I think is important to adopt in academia, which is that of not being the one who knows. I think one of the reasons Matt might have been interested in photography, he refers at some place to ambiguity, is precisely because the arts lead you into greater ambiguity or even ambivalence. The authoritarians also have authoritative knowledge, or they're authoritarian about knowledge. And to confront that or to confound that, you have to sometimes embrace not knowing, which might not appeal to many people, but I do want to preach it for some. I have this quote from Philip Roth in this book that we are discussing here, which goes, "The fact remains," this is from American Pastoral, "the fact remains that getting people right is not what living is all about anyway. It's getting them wrong that is living, getting them wrong and wrong and wrong, and then on careful reconsideration, getting them wrong again. That's how we know we are alive, we are wrong." I embrace this so much that I think I should have it tattooed on me. How to depend on dumbness, because academia teaches us to assume knowledge. I mean, how many of the young folks who are listening to this know that they will be given a job quickly if during an interview they say, "I don't know," But wouldn't it be great if we could say about so many things we don't know and then proceed to find a certain footing in impartial knowledge and then move again so that a career or even one project becomes a process of discovering something? Because otherwise, so much of what we do is guided by certitude that I find it really boring and killing. It's fatal. But you asked about editing.
And can we put up the El Greco painting here? Amitabh, I think that's what you'd like to talk about in relationship to.
Yeah, Facebook is, pretty much useless, except when your friends are posting some articles that you can learn from. But this painting was mentioned in a Facebook post by the writer Garth Greenwell. And it raised a question in my mind. And I had to pay a lot of money to get it printed in this damn book. And here, Greenwell said that he has been getting editorial comments and he's trying to make things better in his manuscript. And then he pointed to this painting and said, "I'm drawn to art in which things are a little askew. Straight realism isn't very interesting to me." And what he's talking about here is, he says, wouldn't an editor want to make, the angle of the chair, which is crooked here, wouldn't he want to make it less strange? And the weird positioning of the hands, wouldn't he want to straighten those out? And then he says, and yet, wasn't their strangeness the key to the greatness of the painting? How to encourage ourselves? I don't know the answer, first of all, to the question. So I don't know. In academia, you don't have editors. Editors really function as acquisition editors. And their main work is that of well-paid clerks very well-paid clerks, who then assign your manuscript to be read by people who they think are appropriate. The real editing comes at that level where someone reviews a book. And are we good as editors? I don't know. We have not been trained either to write. In grad school, I say in this book, no one told me, I had wonderful teachers. They taught me, they exposed me to some great books, but no one told me this is how you should write. in that same way, have we exercised our talents in the matter of editing? I don't know. And that's what we get by way of peer reviews, you know, and I don't trust it that much. Having also published in from non-academic presses, I can say that the process is much, much different, you know, and I wish we had that quality of engagement with the text. Sympathetic engagement. Sometimes it comes through in peer reviews, often it doesn't. And the standard is disappointingly low. What I'm trying to say, my friends, especially to young people who are, you know, in graduate school, man, you need so much courage to pursue strangeness, you know, and in the face of multiple rejections, to say that, yes, I will carve out for myself an idiosyncratic career that is original. And, you know, but that's what has to be done, because editing, how do you do that? I mean, I don't know. I would like some people, you know, who have the book to read this chapter and think, okay, maybe what I need to do is find my voice in a way, or think this is the voice I want, and use that as my guiding light, and not listen to people who dismiss you. End of rant number 4.
Can I offer a comment on that?
Yeah.
Thank you, Amitabha. I love that thinking. I'm working on a project now that's very much in that spirit. It's a kind of side project for me, but it's about creativity and scholarship. And the reason is because I feel like, on the one hand, very few of us that I know of really think much or talk much about creativity with our students. And yet, ask anybody, like, what are your favorite books in the field? And they will name the books that are the most creative and that really lit them up because they're just creative. So, you know,
That's
people like we mentioned Jack Halberstam or, you know, Robin Kelly. Yeah. Like the top of the field is people who are immensely creative. Right. So we need to think about that. So I've been interviewing people. I've done about 35 interviews with people like Jack and Robin. Mm-hmm. And just learning from them about their, you know, their process, about how they got into this business and how they thought about it and how they've evolved. But one of the through lines, and I think this is really important for students to understand, and I wish I had understood it better when I was a grad student, but what I'm coming to learn is that, as you were just saying, Amitabha, the experience of grad school for most people is some version of the experience of being told that you need to become something that you've never been, right? And what I'm finding in talking to the Jack Halberstams and Robin Kellys of the world is that for most people, the real turning point was when they figured out how to make academia into a vehicle to be the person they've always been.
That's exactly right. Yes, yes.
And it's hard to do. You know, I went to grad school in the middle of the kind of US out of Central America movement in the 1980s. And I was a young man on fire about and angry and just politically involved. And the hardest thing for me was learning how to turn that passion into scholarship. And, you know, I was made to feel that, okay, fine, young man, go read these 400 books and then tell us what you think. And it's been a matter of kind of rediscovering my voice from that point on. But I think that just the reorientation that these interviews I'm doing preach and teach is that maybe you can kind of skip a step there and go straight to the, like, I'm going to find my voice. That's my goal as a grad student, is to find my voice, not to mistakenly try to make myself over into this thing that the institution seems to want, but to turn that into a vehicle for who I've always been and what my passions are and my sense of humor and my attachment to beauty and my creativity and all of that.
I agree.
We're transitioning, I think, really well into this kind of the last part of our conversation, and then we'll open it up to questions that that you all post in the Q&A, which is this, you know, the advice for graduate students who are interested in writing both scholarly and creative work. What is your advice broadly to graduate students who, and there are many here who have expressed this interest? Is there a kind of difference in terms of how you pursue that work? And Yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that before I expand.
Go ahead, Matt. You're wiser than I am.
Oh, stop it.
Well, Matt, can I quickly just interrupt you and say that one thing I'm hoping that you both talk about is the ways in which you've become line blurs, the way in which you write in different mediums, and also not just talk about your work with writing, but your work with film and art. I think that would be really, really
sure. Yeah, well, the first thing I'll say, I mean, there is a difference between writing a monograph and writing something else. But I would really urge people to understand it as being merely, and I put that in italics, merely a difference of genre. Mm-hmm. It's not a difference of spirit. It's not a difference of purpose. It's a difference of genre. So in academic work, like, you have to show your work, what they used to say to me in 7th grade math, show your work. And that's kind of what a monograph is. But the spirit of a monograph can be lyrical and poetic and powerful and politically engaged. It can be all those other things that a novel might be, or that an op-ed piece might be, or that a film might be. It's just a generic thing. It's like a hoop you have to jump through. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say is that every project places its own demands on its creator, and we're at our best when we totally give ourselves over to the requirements of the project. So I can give you a couple of examples, but in a general way, I would say my writing process has been different in every book that I've written, because the demands were different, and in giving myself over to the requirements, I just ended up working completely differently and following different paths. So that's one way to think about it. But another, the documentary film I made about with Gaspar Gonzalez about the desegregation of baseball, that started out as a book chapter. That was a chapter in a cultural history of the civil rights era, and the evolution of that project, the way it ends up, it stops being a book chapter. There's a half a second when it's an oral history project, and then it finally becomes a documentary film. But it had to do with my own confronting and really listening to the requirements of the project, and understanding that these stories are so rich, and these old ex-ball players are just so interesting, and so they're scholars of social history, in addition to being scholars of the game, and that their voices are much more important to preserve than anything I could do as a historian writing in a monographic mode. So I would put that out there as an example of just kind of surrendering myself and becoming subservient to what the project itself was seeming to require. And I think that that's when we're at our best, is when we allow ourselves to do that.
Can I ask Matt a question before I go on to my advice, which I don't respect much anyway? So, Matt, if a student of yours looks at your latest book and wants to do that work, and then they say that they are afraid that they won't be granted tenure because it's not traditional work, what will you say to them?
I think that it's a very complicated question, and I think I would be, and probably ought to be, sued for malpractice if I encouraged anybody in 2020 to write a book like Historian's Eye as their dissertation or as their tenure book. On the other hand, I mean, I did write it very much with the idea that that it might clear some space for people to come along behind me and do things. So I hope that that what it does. I mean, so my advice to them would be, keep an eye on the actual rules of the actual institution, because you can't really afford to totally neglect those. But know that there's probably more freedom and more space than you might imagine, and that you can find your way to work with that. And so that might mean you do a labor of love as a side project. It might mean you work on a film or a volume of poetry at the same time that you're kind of checking the boxes by writing a dissertation and making yourself legible to the institution. But my advice to anybody is, this is that the beautiful thing about this profession is actually how much freedom we have, and that don't let the institution cow you into thinking that you don't have it. Like it does, there are constraints and there are rules and there are things you have to be vigilant about, but there are all kinds of things and all different ways of working as a scholar. And I really encourage people to pursue those and to not deny themselves, because I think that's, you know, it's, nobody goes to grad school because they want to connect with the 6 experts in their field. Nobody does that. So when you start thinking,
oh, I don't know.
when you 6, really 6, Amitabha? No, I think that when you start thinking broadly and thinking about larger publics, it actually makes you a better scholar because it keeps you in tune to what's important about the work you wanted to do in the first place.
I think so too. Yeah. I mean, I loved what you said about that your hope is that books like this create a space or clear a space for others to do similar things. Mm-hmm. I certainly wanted to write this book, every day I write the book, where I was thinking of my act as a curatorial act, you know, that I was presenting, apart from doing my own rants or whatever, that I was also presenting work that I thought, because of the way in which it crossed boundaries, would suggest to people, especially to younger scholars, that, oh, there are at least 50 people who have done this. Why shouldn't I? You know, that sort of thing. But what's my advice?
Well,
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Amitabha, there's this section titled For Graduate Students in your book.
That's right.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about that section and what you learned, how you chose the scholars that you chose and what you learned.
Yeah, in the same way as I was, you know, saying to Matt that, my man, why don't you say that? Because I really don't think I am. I thought my own approach would be so bloody, not stupid necessarily, but so particular that I wanted to cast my net wider. Because you know what? I know that I have been, you know, critiquing academia, but academia is a wonderful place for intellectual activity, right? And the wonderful thing is that there are so many different types of intellectuals and all are doing so many interesting things. So I wanted to give that sense, and therefore I wanted to talk. One person, the wonderful Rob Nixon, who was your teacher, Sister Leah, he says here one wonderful thing. He says something like, he has a line about, don't just cultivate your voice, cultivate your voices. Oh yeah, he says, don't just find your voice, find your voices. Mm-hmm. If you're writing on the same subject for, say, an op-ed piece in the New York Times, Critical Inquiry, or Slate, flex your voice to fit the genre and the audience. I think one should be really, so my advice is, first of all, you know, you pick up a magazine and it says 20 ways of having a happy marriage. I'm not the guy who wants 20 ways. I just want one way, man. One way. Give me one way and I will follow it to my end, you know? And so in that one way, to escape a bad marriage, what you have to do, my friends, is think of yourself not as an academic, but think of yourself as a writer. And then when you're being an academic, your writing will have that strength. And when you're writing for a non-academic audience, you will be writing in a different way. Cool? So that's my real advice. And if you're a writer, you will write every day because that's what a writer should do. And that's why there's a section for graduate students where people, all kinds of people, you know, Anna Singh, Kathleen Stewart, Andrew Ross, Rob, my colleague here, Hua Su, Fred Moten. They all, they give advice, but what I also have as an appendix is my own little advice, which includes a very modest thing. Write 150 words every day, walk 10 minutes, you know, mindfully, and then other things. So those little practical details, I think those things are important too, you know, those little bits of practical advice.
Matt, we have a question about practical advice you also have to offer, both on the dissertation and on a daily writing practice. And there's also a question about how you envision the role of public humanities right now.
Okay, I'll take the first part first. So My practical advice about writing, I think it's tough for me because I've worked so differently in different times of my life, and sometimes depending on just what was happening in my life or in the world, and sometimes because of the project I was working on. I think the most important piece of advice that cuts across the whole thing is knowing yourself. Understand your strengths and your weaknesses and your patterns. Understand the difference between a productive day and an unproductive day. And if you realize that you're like in the zone, ride that as long as you can. If you realize that, there are some days, I'll be honest, I could stare at the blank screen for 6 hours and there's no way I'm going to eke out a good sentence. It's just not going to happen.
Man, you're like James Joyce.
But if I recognize within the first, if I recognize in the first hour that that's the kind of day I'm having, there are many other things you can do. You can read, you can do your footnotes, you can do bibliographic work, you can go to the archive. Well, not now, you can't go to the archive now. Don't go to the archive in 2020. But the kinds of projects that we work on require many, many, many different kinds of work, and many of them can be executed even on your worst days. So knowing yourself and your own patterns, I think, is really important in maximizing that. So that's one piece. The public humanities now, there's a consortium of public humanities programs that Yale is a part of, and very proudly, we're one of the founding members of it. And we wrote a white paper on public humanities that I think says it all. But one of the things that the claim that we make is that public humanities, in trying to create different kinds of conversations between academics and non-academics, in trying to find venues outside of the university for the university's work, but also inviting other people in and creating venues for different kinds of conversations, in doing kind of civically minded, politically engaged, publicly minded intellectual work, in thinking about our audiences more broadly than just our students or our editors or our specialist colleagues. All of those things actually return the university itself to what it claims to have had as its mission, right? One way of thinking about this is that sometime in the 20th century, the university abandoned its mission and really kind of in a toxic way turned against what it claimed to be for the society. And public humanities actually reclaims that. And it's interesting that public humanities in most places where it exists is kind of a marginal pursuit, in the sense that it's a kind of conspiracy that's taking place among a couple of radical professors and students here and there. But it's not at the heart of how the university would define itself. But if you really look at what the public humanities is trying to accomplish as an enterprise, it's trying to accomplish what the university itself claimed to accomplish like 3 generations ago. So I see it as a reclaiming of the university for higher purpose.
I want I just want to loop back a little bit, since there's talk of passport photos and for me, barbarian virtues. Can you both talk a little bit about those earlier works and how you came to write them, what kind of risks you felt you had to take when you were writing them, and how you yourselves read them now, looking back at them? And Amitabha, maybe you can go first, since we passport photos has been such a constellation for many of us.
You are too kind. I'm very critical of that book. I like the idea that it was structured as a passport. If I open the page of my passport, it says name, place of birth, date of birth. So that was cool. But it's so horribly fragmented, I don't like that. I actually, in the same way as, you don't, if you remember your youth, and you remember some day when you did something stupid, which I remember many days like that, you think, what was I thinking? How did I not get killed or something like that? You know what I'm saying? In that same way, the daring of that project, because I don't think I really sat down ever and thought, oh, damn, what if I didn't get tenure with this? Or what if it just falls flat and everyone hates it, or it doesn't find a publisher? I didn't think that. A sort of a brash confidence propelled it. So that is great. I appreciate that younger. But I also think that because it was not so deliberative, I often have snippets, and I would prefer, now that I look back at it, and I think I've mentioned it in this book somewhere, that one would have thought that in an ordinary academic career, someone would write the narrative, long thing first, and then this more pomo thing later. But in my career, that came first, and then I became more conservative, you know? I settled down into a desire where I can be creative in my structure or format, but I just want to settle down, you know, into a narrative. And I remember many years ago, maybe 15 years ago, at an ASA, in fact, walking with Manthya Devara and Saidiya Hartman, and Saidiya saying, she had not written these books that have made her very, very famous, but she said at that point, pointing to Manthya, that what she had learned from him was narrative. Manthya had just come out with that book, In Search of Africa, which I admired a lot. You know, a man working at an American institution goes in search of a friend. He uses that conceit to explore the idea of Africa, you know, and African history and fashion and art beautifully, I thought. And Saidiya, I remember her very clearly saying, and that lodging itself in my brain, thinking, whoa, narrative. Yeah, you know. And I think I learned that from people like Naipaul, even if I disagree sometimes with the politics and all that, the idea of how to let one sentence follow from another and another and another and another in order to build up a wall that serves a particular purpose meaningfully. So that's my feeling about passport photos. I've gone on too long. Sorry, Matt.
No, not at all. Oh, let me just say, the thing I love about passport photos, and it was one of the reasons it was such an important book to me, was that it's one of the first books that I thought really got the holy grail of what cultural historians try to do, and that is write about subjectivity in history and kind of capture that intersection, that zone of where the psyche meets the broader kind of structures and histories. And I just found it a really generative, great piece of work.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you.
Thing I'll say about, well, let me just throw out another of my pieces of advice, and this has to do with my experience with Barbarian Virtues, is that if you are in the midst of a project and you have stopped learning, something is wrong. Like if you reach the point where all your writing has become is kind of accounting for your thoughts, but your thoughts are not changing, then you've taken a wrong turn, I think. So one of the things that I value about a good writing day is a day not just where I'm creating something that makes sense and holds up and maybe has its own kind of aesthetic qualities, but has taught me something and has led me to a new way of thinking or a new set of questions or new formulation. I think that's an important way of kind of checking ourselves in terms of how we're doing in our work. Barbarian Virtues was a really funny project for me to work on because the idea was not mine. My first book is about immigration, but it used empire and foreign policy as a backdrop, kind of sounding board for thinking about immigrant politics and how these different immigrant groups were thinking about American empire and as a way of locating themselves as Americans or not. And then my second book it's the race book that everyone seems to know, The Whiteness of a Different Color, but it has a section on empire. And shortly after, I guess I was still working on whiteness, but Liz Cohen called me and she was editing this series for Hill and Wang, and she said, I really want a volume that brings foreign policy and immigration together, and you're the only person I can think of who could really do it the way I want it done. Would you do it? So it was almost, I mean, it was like on consignment, kind of like I just took her idea and did it. But so this back to like the keep learning. So it's a very synthetic book. I mean, there was some research that I did on that, but you know, 90% of it was just synthesizing the existing research and trying to spin it into a new form to bring these two fields that had always been kind of separate, to bring them together. But the learning curve for me, and the kind of puzzle, personal puzzle that's at the center of that project was, can I figure out a way to make my own Marxism elegant? And that was, I think for me, that's what that book does. That's what I like about the book. I mean, just the structure of the book and the narrative line, and that's a book that I do think actually has some beauty to it. But as a personal quest, it was really about just trying to do something elegant with my own kind of political framework of thinking.
Mm-hmm. We have, thanks so much for both of those. We have, I think, time for maybe one more question that was posted. It's related to, Matt and Amitabha, to what you both said. Amitabha, you were saying that, you know, in graduate school, you didn't really get much instruction about writing. And the question here is from one of the attendees: why do you think writing is not sufficiently emphasized during both undergraduate and graduate training in the social sciences and humanities? And the addendum to that is that this person was told that one shouldn't worry too much about writing because you can always hire an editor.
No, that's why I was saying that one should identify oneself as a writer, not as an academic. So you have to be a...
Could you explain what that means?
Well, when you come to the customs desk, it says sometimes you have to write your profession. Mm-hmm. And for me, there was a real, what theorists call epistemological break. I think that's what it meant. I don't know. When I thought instead of professor, I could write writer. You know, it's a way of orienting yourself to the world. So to carry a notebook all the time and a pen all the time is a part of the orientation or the reorientation of oneself from being only, for me at least, from being an academic, a member of the professoriate, to becoming a person who was engaging in a public humanities, was to think of myself as a writer. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to answer that question to the person by saying, no. You cannot relegate it to some future editor. You have to think of yourself as a writer. Now, why is it not taught? I don't know. I mean, the ancient epic Mahabharata has this family struggle between the Kauravas and the Pandavas. Huge motherfucking battle. And you know what? Every English department that I have been a member of has this battle between the creative writers and the theorists or the literary critics. It just doesn't make sense to me. It is a stupid war. It is based in a limited idea of disciplines, etc. And it keeps so-called creative writers stupid, and it keeps certain literary critics and theorists unimaginative or uncreative, if there is not a blurring between these two lines. Why are they not taught? I don't know. All the creative writers have these workshops, but they don't read all the important books that I would like my students in cultural studies to read. And then the folks who are in literary studies, they read wonderful, wonderful books, but they do not, I don't see them having writing workshops, or thinking about craft, or thinking about form, or thinking about how to make their own Marxism elegant. It doesn't happen. There isn't a systematic addressal of questions of craft, style, etc. You know? So I don't have the answer, but I'm saying it's a sorry situation. And I've written this book in order to say that it is precisely in the blurring of the lines between these divisions that the most interesting work will arise, and has already arisen.
Mm-hmm. I guess my answer to that question, well, first of all, I mean, so the creativity project that I mentioned that I'm working on before, but the reason for that book is exactly the thing that you're pointing to in your question.
But Matt, how come you have not interviewed me so far in that project? I just don't understand.
because time is short, and it's very hard.
Cool.
For me to get
I'm just teasing you, baby.
I know you are, but we'll have that conversation. Actually, the Zoom world has totally opened up my, how this can work. But anyway, my own answer to the question, though, so that project is meant to address the need that you're pointing to. My own answer to it is not a very charitable one, to our profession or our colleagues, but I look at it this way. I think that in part, it's a cop-out. I think in part, we assume that people are supposed to know how to write when they walk in the door, and so we just don't give it much. Another piece of this is that nobody taught us to write for the same reason. So a lot of us don't feel actually qualified to teach writing in our disciplines, right? If you're a historian, there are exceptions. When John Demos was here, he had just wonderful writing workshops, and he cared about the craft of the prose and the beauty and the lyricism and the storytelling and all of that. And he really taught that. For those who were lucky enough to work with Glenda Gilmore, I mean, she just would roll up her sleeves and get in there at the level of line editing. I've never been able to work that way. I mean, I think it's just not my strength. I think much more conceptually, and that's kind of the kind of teaching and advice I tend to give to students, is I can see the big picture really well. And like, you know, here's how your chapters are trying to fit together and they're not, or here's what this chapter is trying to achieve and it's not, and here's why, or whatever. But I wouldn't call that teaching or writing. And I think it's just a cop-out. One thing I do, though, in pretty much all of my grad classes, I do devote 1 week to a book that I've written just to make myself available as a practitioner, and let students, you know, let's just talk for 2 hours about how I did this, why I did this, choices I made, what I might do differently, whatever. Because I think that's another problem. We tend not to work with our students as though we're practitioners. So our students are surrounded by people who have a ton of experience writing books, and they're never talking about writing books, right? They're getting, you know, they get good advice on their own work and they get critiques of their chapters or whatever, but nobody's really talking to them very directly often about, like, here's how you write a book. So I think we need to do more of that. And I think it's a shame. And I think that, you know, that the choices we make to not see ourselves or fancy ourselves as writing teachers is false, because we all, you know, we do have a ton of experience. And I mean, we're just surrounded by people who have written brilliant books. So they've got to have something to say about the craft.
Yep. We have just a couple minutes left. And so maybe I'll ask us to finish off with this. For students, undergraduate and graduate, who want to do public-facing work, they're in the middle of a dissertation or they're just started a PhD program. What is your advice to them? And then for those who are interested in participating in the project of public humanities, and Matt, as you said, in reclaiming the university, how do we do that?
Matt should answer that.
No, I'm sorry?
I said Matt should answer that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so let me think. There were 2 questions there. The first one was what to do if you find yourself wanting to do public-facing work. Was that the question? Sure. Come see me. There's the start if you're at Yale. But I think the first step is to really think about what that might look like for a given project. Like if you're imagining something spinning out of your dissertation, like what are those choices? Does it mean putting together a digital archive that's the materials you're working with? Do you want to do an installation? Do you want to do, you know, a podcast or film? I mean, there are a million ways that, I mean, public facing work is multifaceted. There are many different things that you could do. So one, and again, it just comes to that understanding the requirements of the project. Like what would be the best form and platform and format for a public kind of facing version of the thing that I'm working on, and answer that question first, and then figure out who should I talk to? What are the skills that I don't have that I need? What are the strengths that I do have that could come into play here? I mean, do a kind of personal inventory at that level. But I guess, you know, the best advice is just be not afraid, you know, take that step, because it's important. The work that you're doing is important. And if it is important, it's important to get it out there beyond, as I was saying before, the 6 experts in your subfield. So I encourage people to think that way. I guess the larger question you were asking was an institutional one. What was the question?
Yeah, you mentioned that the project of public humanities is reclaiming the university. And I was asking, how does one participate in that project? Yeah,
well, so I mean, it's different at every university, and but find that community. I mean, there are people who are like-minded who are trying to do this kind of work at every institution I know anything about. And the formations can be quite different from one place to another, just based on institutional, based on who's in the room and what their interests are and what the history is and what the institutional politics are. Like at Lehigh, Public Humanities kind of resides in the English department because that was just the group of people who picked it up. At Yale, traditionally it's been American Studies, although that is changing. It's different every place, but find that community, and community is key because it's the collectivity. It's not just the public that you're reaching for. It's the infrastructure and the intellectual public that you're engaging with in doing this work. And I think the beauty of the title in Susan Smolian's recent book, Doing Public Humanities, it's the doing, it's the verb. Public humanities is a verb, and we need to think of it that way. And it's the doing that's actually as important as the so-called product. It's the process and the communities that get engaged in working that through. So I'd really encourage that student, and if we're thinking about this as a project of reclaiming the university, a piece of that is reclaiming the idea of collectivity and collaboration and co-creation, and breaking outside of the highly individualized models that we have inherited.
Did you want me to say something? I think Matt has said everything. Leah and I have a mutual friend, Teju Cole. His recent piece in the New York Times Magazine on Caravaggio, and what he's been doing. Today I sent a link to my students about what Teju was posting on Instagram. Just pictures of his kitchen counter, but the way he writes about salt, sugar, colonialism, and emotions of being hungry or having food. I presented that example to my students today, like, this is happening just today, check it out. Because I want to say to your students who might be listening, Leah, that examples like that of people who are rigorous and yet endlessly inventive in every medium should be chosen as models so that you find something that is similar and also refine your own difference by playing it against that sort of thing. I think that's the only thing I would like to add to everything that Matt has said.
One more thing I'll throw out there, just bouncing off of that. In thinking about who your models are, do not limit yourself to people in your field.
That's right.
Or even in your discipline, or even in your genre. I mean, some of my models over the years have been from political scientists to poets to novelists to other historians to literary critics. I mean, don't limit the scope of your own world and who your mentors might be to the people directly in your field.
Amitabha, I'll say this for you. One thing you usually tell your students is to keep 5 books when they're trying to, maybe you can just say that and we can end. It relates really nicely to what Matt just said.
Yeah, you know how Matt was saying that every project he has done has had a different frame or works differently? Well, I always think 5 to 10 or 6 to 10 books on the shelf next to me for that particular project, So for anything you're writing, how to have that, and then that's the community for me, that's my imagined community, where folks you're in conversation with and trying to define your art, trying to test your writing. If I'm like Teju, for example, whose books are here, I mean, it starts with John Berger, So for me to find John Berger and to then have his books on the shelf, and then Susan Sontag, or for that matter, if you're thinking about narrative, Joan Didion, and just expand it, go further, that has been great for me. And I would recommend that folks to do the same.
Great. Thank you guys so much for talking with us for this conversation. Yeah. It's one I wish I'd, I wish I could have had.
When you were a grad student.
Yeah. But I'm delighted that we could have it now, and thank you guys so much for your time and your work.
thanks for the invitation. This has really been great. And it's great to reconnect with Amitabha after all these years.
Oh my God, yes. Thank you. And thanks also. I also want to send out greetings to any other folks from Yale who might be here, you know. Certainly Lisa Lowe, who said that she was there, but Stephen Pitti, Alicia, Zarina, all those folks. Stay in touch. Don't be a stranger. All right. Be well. See you guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Leah.
Thanks, Leah.
And thank you, Karen.